All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're diving deep into the science of your own mind. We're talking about the invisible mental software that's running in the background, shaping everything from why you can't find your keys to how you make some of the biggest decisions in your life.
Think about it for a second. We're constantly bombarded with interviews from startup founders who hit it big, or that one person who actually won the Powerball. But what about everyone else? What about all the people who didn't make it?
And this XKCD comic just nails it. This gets to the heart of a really common thinking error called survivorship bias. It's our natural tendency to focus only on the lucky few who survived some process, while we completely ignore the massive number of failures. We hear from the one person who risked it all on a business and succeeded, but we don't hear from the thousands who did the same and lost everything. And that completely messes with our perception of what's risky and what's a sure thing.
So these kinds of mental shortcuts, these little glitches in our thinking, that is exactly what cognitive psychology is all about. So what is this field, really? In a nutshell, it's the science of how our minds actually work.
Okay, here's the textbook definition, but let's break that down. Cognitive psychology is basically the study of all our mental operations. It's about how we take in information from the world, how we process it, and how we use it to navigate our lives. It's not just about what we think, it's about how we think. And the scope here is just massive. I mean, cognitive psychologists are looking at everything. How do you manage to focus on one conversation in a super noisy room? Why do we forget things we were sure we'd remember? How do we learn a language as a kid or solve a puzzle? It touches on pretty much every single aspect of our mental lives.
You know, for a long time, psychology was really dominated by what's called behaviorism, which only focused on actions you could see and measure. But then thinkers like Jean Piaget started studying how kids' thinking develops, and clever experiments like the candle problem showed our functional fixedness, our tendency to only see an object as having one purpose. All this started to change things. The real turning point, though, was in 1967, Ulrich Neisser published his book, and that really launched cognitive psychology as the science of the mind itself.
So this raises a huge question. How in the world do you scientifically study something you can't see? I mean, you can't put a thought or a decision under a microscope. This was the big challenge for those early pioneers.
Way back in the 1800s, a scientist named F.C. Donders asked this exact question. At the time, pretty much everyone just assumed that making a choice was instant, like a little flash of inspiration in your head. But Donders, he had a really clever idea to see if that was true.
And what he came up with was just so elegant in its simplicity. Donders designed two simple tasks. First, he measured how long it took someone to just press a button the moment they saw a light. Easy enough? That's your reaction time. Then, he added a choice. People had to press a left button for a left light or a right button for a right light. So now you've got reaction time plus decision time. And here's the genius part. By subtracting the first time from the second, he could isolate that one hidden variable, the actual time it took to make the choice.
And this is what he found. It took about 1/10 of a second. Now, that might seem like nothing, a tiny fraction of time, but it proves something absolutely revolutionary.
And here's the huge takeaway from that. Thinking is not some magical instantaneous event. It's a physical process that takes real measurable time. We still can't measure a thought directly, right? But by carefully measuring behavior, like reaction time, we can start to figure out what's happening inside the mind. This insight basically blew the doors open for studying the mind scientifically. Okay, so that's the science, but how does all this stuff actually translate into the real world? Because understanding our own mental machinery isn't just an academic exercise, it gives us the tools to actually improve our lives.
Remember how we started with a thinking error? Well, it turns out our minds are absolutely full of them. Take memory, for example. We tend to think of our memory like a perfect video camera, recording everything exactly as it happened. But it's just not. Groundbreaking research by people like Elizabeth Loftus has shown that our memories are shockingly easy to influence, and sometimes they can even be completely made up. And this example just illustrates the point perfectly. In one famous study, researchers showed participants fake ads for Disneyland that just happened to include Bugs Bunny. Later on, a significant number of these people claimed they vividly remembered meeting Bugs at the park. They described shaking his hand, touching his ears, an event that is literally impossible because Bugs Bunny is a Warner Bros. Character. It just shows how easily our memories can be rewritten without us having a clue.
But okay, here's the really empowering part.
Once we understand these quirks, these limitations of our own minds, we can start to develop strategies to work with our cognitive architecture, not against it. And this is especially true when it comes to learning.
Cognitive psychology has handed us some incredible evidence-based tools to learn better. For example, we know for a fact that our brains hold on to information way better when we study it in spaced-out intervals, instead of cramming it all in the night before an exam. That's called spaced repetition. Or we can use mnemonic devices, creating a little story or an acronym to hook new information onto something we already know. It just makes it so much easier to pull it back out later.
And the impact goes even deeper, straight into the world of mental health. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one of the most effective, well-researched therapies out there for things like depression and anxiety, and it is built directly on these cognitive principles. The whole idea is that by learning to identify and reframe our own faulty or negative thinking patterns, we can fundamentally change our emotions and our well-being for the better.
But of course, no field of science is perfect, right? To get the full picture, we really have to look at some of the challenges and the criticisms that cognitive psychology still faces today.
A really big one is something called ecological validity. See, a lot of these classic cognitive experiments, like Donder's, they happen in these super controlled sterile lab settings, and that's fantastic for isolating one specific variable. But the real world, well, it's messy, it's complicated, it's full of emotions and social pressures. So critics argue that what we find in the lab might not always apply perfectly to our complex everyday lives.
And there are other critiques too. Some suggest that cognitive models can sometimes oversimplify just how incredibly intricate the human mind really is. And historically, the field has been criticized for not paying enough attention to the powerful role that our emotions and social context play in our thinking. Now, these are all really valid points, and they're things that researchers today are actively working on to create an even more complete science of the mind.
So what have we seen? Our minds are incredibly powerful, but they're also prone to making mistakes. We're all influenced by biases, and our memories are definitely not perfect recordings. But, and this is the important part, we also have the ability to understand these flaws. So the real question this leaves us with is this. Now that you can see the inner workings of your own mind a little more clearly, how are you going to use that knowledge to think differently?